And I just want to say that it's truly a horrifying, and it's beyond comprehension what occurred here. The young man's unimaginable suffering over the course of 2 decades is just a reminder of the darkness that does exist in our world.
For 20 years, a Connecticut man was held captive by his own mother, locked in a tiny room, starved and hidden from the world. His only escape came by setting his prison on fire. This shocking case exposes the dark failures of homeschooling laws and child welfare oversight that allowed suffering to go unnoticed for decades. Well, hey everybody, welcome to Profiling Evil, your go-to true crime channel. Now, if you're passionate about unraveling mysteries and understanding the psychology of crime, you've come to the right place. But before we jump into today's case, I hope you'll just take a quick moment. Hit that like and subscribe button down below, and make sure that you're sharing Profiling Evil with your friends. And please don't forget to give us a thumbs up. Now, on February 17th, 2025, a harrowing story of captivity and abuse emerged in Waterbury, Connecticut, when a structure fire led authorities to the most shocking discovery many of those first responders have ever had in their career. A man who had been held hostage by his own mother for more than 2 decades. The victims in this case is being identified as MV1. That stands for male victim number 1. And he is described as a 32-year-old man who suffered unimaginable cruelty, deprivation, and psychological torment at the hands of someone who should have had his interests at the forefront, his mother, Kimberly Sullivan. Now, she's the alleged perpetrator in this thing, but it's going to be pretty hard, I think, to fight any kind of allegation that she wasn't aware and allowed it to continue to happen. The arrest affidavit, compiled by Detective Stephen Brownell and other law enforcement folks, provided a disturbing narrative of a life that was stolen from childhood. MV1 was born in May of 1983. And his early memories of abuse, something that he told investigators at the hospital after he was recovered from that fire, date back to when he was around 3 years old. Can you imagine? Initially, his confinement was limited to nighttime hours as kind of a form of punishment for seeking food because he was hungry. At an early age, he was forced to drink from the toilet due to water deprivation. And by the 4th grade, this child was permanently removed from school after teachers and staff repeatedly contacted the Department of Children and Family Services regarding his apparent malnourishment and the fact that he was going around and begging other students for something to eat. The kid was starving to death. From then on, his education ceased, apart from brief exposures to some worksheets, but that really never accounted to much. Now, his confinement grew even more severe. He had locks that evolved from chains on the door to padlocks and a slide bolt that prevented escape. They were on the outside of the door of the bedroom where he was kept. At age 12, he was moved from a bedroom to an even smaller storage space that measured approximately 8 feet by 9 feet. But this thing had slanted ceilings, so imagine how confining it was. It had no air conditioning, so in the summer it was sweltering hot as it was on the 2nd floor, and in the winter it had no heat. By his early teenage years, he was only being let out of that little bedroom for a limited time each morning to do household chores, and then he would be locked up for the remainder of the day. Now, his father was living in the home, as were, I think, 2 stepsisters. His father provided slight relief on the weekends when the mother would take the daughters out to go do things. The boy was never allowed to go. Now, the father would allow him to sometimes sneak downstairs and watch television occasionally, and from time to time go outside. But this is, again, to me, one of the more troubling things about this case, because this victim had two half sisters and he had extended family members. And one uncle is kind of suggesting that the family tried to check into the situation, but no one went to the police or the Division of Family Services demanding that this child's welfare be checked out. In fact, the last time this little boy, then little boy, left the residence was when he was around 14 or 15 years old, which would have been about 3 or 4 years into his full-time captivity. Now, when his father died just last year, his confinement became even worse, if you can even imagine. He was only let out for brief minutes to let the family dog outside. The dog must have had better deal than he had. His diet consisted primarily of 2 peanut butter sandwiches a day, or maybe some deli meat, and occasionally maybe some tuna or egg salad. He said hunger was a constant presence, and he told investigators that he doesn't even remember ever not being hungry. As you can tell, I'm pretty emotionally bent on this particular story, folks. I just can't imagine that children have to live this way, or captured adults. He developed an elaborate system to dispose of his own waste during the entire 20 years. He would urinate into his little water bottles, and he created through some makeshift straws a way to kind of channel that out a tiny hole in the window to the rooftop of his house. He would go to the bathroom on a piece of newspaper and wrap it up and tie it with a little bit of thread that he'd torn from a piece of clothing until he could get downstairs and dump it out in the garbage. His hygiene was virtually non-existent, with self-bathing being done only when he could save enough of his drinking water to kind of wash himself with a cloth. He doesn't recall, even in the last 2 years, having a bath. Now, MV1's only source of information came through a tiny radio that was outside of his room. And in that, he says he followed things like world events, NASCAR, and Yukon. He had a little dictionary in the house, or in that little cubby hole that he was in. And when he heard words that he didn't understand, he would look them up. So he was kind of self-educated, apparently enough that he could communicate with law enforcement when they interviewed him. And despite his isolation, again, he'd use this dictionary, he'd use what he got from the radio, but he was never allowed visitors or friendships. He lived as the family secret. And again, after his father died, he was given his father's clothes to wear because he had nothing. And this was to somehow kind of supplement his meager wardrobe. But this was a year before the fire. And during that time, he happened to find in one of his father's pockets a lighter. He hung on to that, waiting for the right moment. After years of captivity, 20 years, and worsening conditions, he finally made the desperate decision to start a fire in order to escape. He set the fire in his little room using some hand sanitizer that he had, paper, and the lighter, knowing that the blaze would force emergency responders to his home. And then he had the presence of mind to let this fire get big enough in there before he started screaming and banging on the door so that his mother couldn't put it out on her own. When she did try, and she couldn't, she was forced to call 911. But she attempted to cover up his presence, making him go downstairs and wash his face. This man indicated that he hadn't had a haircut in more than 2 years, and police describe him as just having this matted head full of hair when they got to him. Well, because of the fire, this boy deliberately collapsed on the floor and wouldn't allow his mother to carry him downstairs. That forced medical personnel to come up into the room and fire personnel to remove him from the house. When he was taken to the hospital, They discovered that he only weighed 68 pounds and he was 5 foot 9 inches tall. He had a body mass index of 11, which is classified as life-threatening. According to the medical exam records, he exhibited severe muscle atrophy. He had joint contractures, extreme dental decay, and he was obviously suffering from PTSD and depression. Now, his cognitive development was considered to be adolescent-like, and keep in mind, this kid had never interacted with modern technology, including an iPad or a microwave, because the police officer actually tried to have him show him some things on an iPad, and the kid had never even seen one. And I keep saying kid because he was captured as a child, and yet he's now an adult, 32 years old. Medical staff confirmed his condition as near starvation, with life-threatening risks associated with giving him proper nutrition. His uncle visited him in the hospital and remarked that he looked like a Holocaust survivor. Well, within a few days, investigators secured 2 search warrants for the home, where they confirmed the presence of these locking devices on the outside of that room door, and some additional plywood barriers that were built in to support the door and make it even more difficult to get out of. A warrant for Kimberly Sullivan's arrest was issued, and they charged her with a number of crimes. Number one, assault in the first degree, kidnapping in the second degree, unlawful restraint in the first degree, cruelty to persons, and reckless endangerment in the first degree. Sullivan wouldn't talk to police at the crime scene, invoking her right to an attorney. Her daughters, who were also aware of their brother's captivity, but say they didn't participate in it, were questioned and have not been charged at this point. And again, keep in mind, his father has passed away. So how did this man fall under the radar of, as a child, the Connecticut school system or the Division of Family Services? You see, when MV1 was taken out of school, there was a clear record of school officials reporting welfare concerns for the 11-year-old. So who cares if they said they were going to homeschool him? How did he fall off the records and completely fall off the map? From what I've been able to find online, Connecticut law requires parents who are homeschoolers to file notices of intent with their local school district each and every year. But there's no requirement for ongoing oversight, no requirement for mandatory testing, no requirement for curriculum review, and most critically, no periodic welfare checks. That's in the best circumstances. MV1 left the school system under a cloud of concern. The school people were indicating, teachers and the principal, that they were concerned about his safety, and yet he was forgotten. This allowed Kimberly Sullivan and her husband, quite frankly, and perhaps those sisters, to isolate this young man completely for more than 2 decades without any government intervention. And this continues to trouble me because from age 11 to 18, this kid was removed from school and nobody checked on him. Unlike some states that require periodic assessments or these portfolio reviews for homeschooled children, it doesn't appear that Connecticut has any mechanism for ensuring continued education, but I might be wrong, and I hope that that comes up and is answered. And while the Department of Children and Families was alerted multiple times before MV1 was withdrawn, there were no follow-up checks once he was homeschooled. And then, after being pulled from school, MV1 simply became a ghost in the system. No medical visits, no school records, no law enforcement contact, nothing since 2005. And it appears by looking online that the state of Connecticut doesn't mandate routine welfare visits to homeschool children, which means that unless a new complaint is filed, DCF has no obligation to check on a child's well-being. So in MV1's case, His total isolation went unnoticed for 20 years, despite the fact that there were concerns when he left the school system. Now, I get it. They wouldn't likely check on him after age 18, but there were 7 years from the time he left school that he was still a minor. I just don't get it. His malnourishment, developmental delay, and lack of medical care could have been detected if somebody had gone and done a welfare check. His situation only came to light because he set fire to his own prison cell, demonstrating how extreme abuse can persist undetected under current law. This case exposes the dangers of unchecked homeschooling in Connecticut and perhaps all over the world, and particularly in families with a history of abuse or neglect. If stronger oversight policies were in place, MV1 may have been rescued years earlier, if not decades earlier. And I would hope that a whole bunch of embarrassed social workers and politicians are rethinking the possibility of potential reforms that could prevent future cases like this. Things like mandatory annual welfare checks, things that require DCFS or local law enforcement or officials to check on these homeschooled kids at least annually. There needs to be some kind of a strong homeschool oversight committee that looks at testing, portfolio reviews, or interviews to ensure that a child's well-being is the first thing that's being considered. And there needs to be a mechanism in place for enhanced follow-ups on past DCF cases so that a family that has prior cases, like the Sullivan case did, are required to complete mandatory follow-up checks, even if the kid is homeschooled. This case demonstrates how legal loopholes in homeschooling and welfare check policies enabled a mother to imprison, starve, and psychologically condition her child for 2 decades. The state's failure to follow up after MV1's school withdrawal left him vulnerable to unimaginable abuse. This case should serve as a catalyst for some kind of legislative change, something that might prevent future cases of extreme isolation, neglect, and abuse from ever happening again. It's a stark reminder of the horrors that can occur behind closed doors, hidden away from society. MV1's story raises serious questions about the failures of our child welfare system, the lack of follow-up on previous DCF reports, and the depths of psychological manipulation that can keep victims silent for decades. His ordeal is an indictment of how isolation and control can be weaponized, not just by criminals in the shadows, but by those entrusted with care, in this case, his own family. As MV1 recovers and the world watches, we hope that he'll somehow reclaim the years that have been stolen from him and find a pathway toward healing and freedom at last. Can you imagine suddenly being introduced into the world in which we all live after this kind of experience? Well, let's take a moment and watch the press conference on this case.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation with you. As you all know, on February 17th, around 8:40 p.m., Waterbury police responded to 2 Blake Street on a report of a fire. Officers and fire investigators immediately realized there were some grave concerns about some of the conditions in the house. There were 2 occupants of the house, one being Kimberly Sullivan, the stepmother of the male victim. Officers and fire investigators quickly realized that there was a room in the house that appeared to have locks on it from the exterior portion of the house. They began to speak to the male victim, who disclosed that he was being held captive in the house for an extended period of time, approximately 20 years. The investigation began from that point. We worked closely with the State's Attorney's Office, Maureen Platt, as well as Assistant State's Attorney Don Thurkelson, because frankly, what was being reported was unfathomable to us at that point in time. Through those investigative meetings and through search warrants, we were able to seize physical evidence and conduct interviews and dig up some more information that corroborated the victim's story. This investigation, as the mayor points out, continues, is very open and very active. We were able to obtain arrest warrants for Kimberly Sullivan. She was arrested yesterday. She was arraigned in Waterbury Superior Court. She's currently being held on a $300,000 bond. The biological father is deceased and died in January of 2024. Prior to his death, he was wheelchair bound from some medical conditions. So we're doing some background investigation. There are two incidents that we had within our computer system of dealing with that address and with the family back in 2005. One was a request from DCF to do a welfare check at the location because children that the victim was familiar with hadn't seen him and they were concerned about him. Officers went to the house. The house was clean. It was lived in. They spoke to the victim at that point in time, and there were no cause for any alarm or any conditions that existed that would have led officers to believe anything other than a normal childhood and a normal family existence was occurring. But that was reported back to DCF, and that was the last that we were involved in that particular investigation. We were called back to the house in the latter part of April by the family who wanted to file a harassment complaint against members of the school district, saying that they were continuously reporting them to DCF and felt that they were trying to get the family in trouble and have the family investigated. We have no further information about where that went other than there was no proof provided by the family that there was any type of harassment that was occurring. As far as the school district's concerned, we are looking at those records now. We're working with DCF to look at records that they may have from previous investigations, and that's part of the ongoing investigation. So this former principal is now disclosing all this information, and I believe in the news clips I've reviewed that he was making calls to DCF and other agencies. Waterbury Police were never notified by this particular principal about those conditions. So this is all information that is coming out now as this case unfolds. Right. So there's some physical evidence that was seized from the house that does corroborate the fact that that room did have exterior locks on it and a number of different styles of exterior locks, as was explained during an interview with the victim throughout the years. It appeared that the locks increased in security levels as time progressed, and obviously he became older and maybe a little bit stronger. So that's certainly one component, and then there's other components of the fire investigation that are yes, there were two siblings. They were in and out of the home, but they have since. You're going to have to talk to DCF about what their protocol is on when they share information with police. DCF does work closely with police departments. It provides a lot of information to police departments in a number of different ways. I don't know what their protocol is on when they share that information. Right, so obviously he's got a lot of mental health issues that he has to deal with at this point in time. There are a lot of physical conditions that he's working on as well. I mean, here's an adult that was 5'9" and 68 pounds. There's some apparent orthopedic issues. The room was very small. Honestly, when I read about it and talk to the investigators and overlook the interviews, it was worse than the conditions of a jail cell. So there's a lot of physical therapy that he'll have to go through. There's a lot of healing that he'll have to go through mentally. And I can tell you this: our investigators, and I'll specifically point out Detective Steve Brownell and Detective John Pace, who were the lead investigators in this particular case, but all the investigators, the entire Criminal Investigations Bureau, has been very supportive of the victim. They took a collection up and bought him some items to try to make life more comfortable, some clothing and some books and some things to kind of get him along the way as he goes through this process. But our plan is to continue to support him. He's going to need a lot of support as he travels through this and tries to figure out how to navigate what has occurred and what the future holds for him. So the backdrop is being formed, and this is, again, why the investigation continues. It appears that it was a very controlling situation going on regarding the victim's condition, his whereabouts, his connection with other family members, other people in the community, other friends. Information was very guarded on what was released and when he was able to see other members of the family and other members of the community. And I think that, I know, from information provided in the interviews that there was a level of fear on retaliation on what would occur if information was released or help was provided to the victim by family members. No, again, I don't, from what we've put together so far, no, and that's because of a fear of retaliation. I mean, he, in his room, to relieve himself, right, had this elaborate mechanism that he created where he would urinate in a bottle, and he had straws connected to the bottom of the bottle, and he found a hole in the storm window frame that he was able to put these straws through. And he did that because the storm window itself wouldn't open up, and he was fearful that if he broke that storm window or tried to open it up, that there would be some retaliation. So, I'm certainly not a psychologist or psychiatrist, but there's a lot of nuances to people that are victims and held captive, and I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done with this particular gentleman in that area to really determine all the impact and all the effects that this long-term condition has really. 33 years of law enforcement, this is the worst treatment of humanity that I've ever witnessed, right? I mean, honestly, when we first started talking about it, we really couldn't believe it. It took a lot of convincing amongst ourselves to just really accept what was going on, and it's really hard to talk about still. I mean, it's shuddering to think that someone would treat any person, let alone a family member or someone that was entrusted as a guardian or a parental figure in this way.
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, it's just unfathomable that anyone could treat someone this way, as the chief said, especially within the relationship that they had. It's devastating, and we're going to make sure that the systems are working into the future to see what might have happened 20 years ago when this may have been reported. But at this point, it appears that this was just really an isolated sense, and that they were locked in there all by themselves, and through fear and intimidation, she was able to keep it secret all that time.
Well, there you go, folks. I hope you'll take time to enter your comments down below, and please weigh in on the comments made by others. This is a delicate situation, so I hope you'll be kind with one another. And thanks for tuning in to Profiling Evil. I really do appreciate your support, and I love having you along for the journey. Don't forget to check us out on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. And if you like audio podcasts, make sure you're subscribed to Profiling Evil's audio podcasts on your favorite podcast platform. And if you want more content, head over to profilingevil.com and check out our website for all our story maps and the missing persons and unsolved homicides map and many, many other things, including a place where you can sign up for our digital newsletter, The Bolo. And while you're at Profiling Evil, check out my books on the website. If you like true crime, I think you'll like Deceived, an investigative memoir of the Zion Society cult, or She Knew No Fear. And I hope you're looking forward to my new book that's going to be coming out sometime this summer. Well, thanks for your support of Profiling Evil. We'll see you soon at the next crime scene.